Hello everyone and welcome to the Traveller in the Evening podcast. It's me, Andy Wilson, speaking for the Traveller in the Evening, and tonight's topic was supposed to be an overview of 30 odd years of electronic music from when I was sort of first aware of it in the early 70s through to the 80s and 90s, and it really was a sort of argument about the inadequacies of some of the music that was made. And Conor Kostick being my guest in the show, Conor and I had a long discussion about that, and in the end we got quite confused, and so many issues were raised that were difficult to pin down, and I ended up being quite frustrated with the recording we made because it opened up so many questions that we may well visit in future, but it was quite confused, the discussion, I think. So what I've done for tonight's meeting is just taken my introduction from my discussion with Conor, which was a pretty long preamble about my own experiences, and that's what you'll be listening to tonight. So there's a few other points I'd like to make, apart from apologising to Conor for cutting our discussion so short for the broadcast. But there's a couple of other points I wanted to make. The first of those is that the icon and the title for this meeting mention Iancu Dumitrescu, who has been a crucially important composer for me, and yet I don't discuss him much in the preamble that I'm broadcasting. Still, he is the focus of the whole meeting, even when he isn't being mentioned, because part of what I'm trying to argue is that all of the things that I found attractive in electronic music, in electronic rock music, in the electronic underground, in industrial music, all of the things that I found most engaging, in a sense, Iancu brings all of those things out and systematically treats them in a reproducible way. And for me, he's one of the most important composers of the last century. So I make no apology for featuring him so heavily in the time and the text for the meeting, even though I don't discuss him at great length in the podcast itself. He is the point of the meeting, nevertheless. What I've done very unusually, or perhaps it won't be so unusual in future, but for the first time in these podcasts, I've heavily soundtracked it. So while we're talking about music, you'll hear it playing in the background. So there are selections from, obviously, Iancu himself, but also from David Bowie, from Throbbing Gristle, and quite a few unannounced from myself, from my own archives. And then the final point is that I tell a story in there about Simon Crabb selling synthesizers to Throbbing Gristle. I think I got the story the wrong way round. I think he claims that he bought his MS-20 from Throbbing Gristle, not that it makes much difference. So with that said, we'll start the podcast in a moment. Final thing I need to add is that normally in the run out to the show, I will gently remind you to come and subscribe to the Traveller in the Evening, but this time we're ending the show in a different way, so I'll do the reminding now and say that no matter how you came across this podcast, it's connected with the Traveller in the Evening Substack blog, so it would be really great if you got yourself over to the Traveller in the Evening, which is at travellerintheevening, or one word, .com. That will get you there. And if you could subscribe, that would be great. If you could take out a paid subscription, even greater. But either way, you will find out about future podcasts and future articles and blog posts and so on. And so, with that said, I'll hand over now to the recording, as it were, and thanks very much for tuning in as always, and see you next time. So what I want to do now is say something about the history of electronic music, and whatever I say is going to be controversial, just because it's my opinion, and I've been making electronic music for many years, but I've got quite a critical opinion about what passes for electronic music today. I say it's critical. I suppose what I'm saying is that it's not what it appears to be. So what I'm talking about is that we have so much amazing equipment for making music with now. You know, if you see the advertisements for some of the software, now, quite apart from any criticism of the kind of nature of software in and of itself, nevertheless, you can If you've got a reasonably powerful computer, which most children have, because they've got a games machine, right? That's a good. You've got a reasonably powerful computer. You can install on it digital audio workstations, endless synthesizers, incredible physical modeling synthesizers. I was looking at a piece of software today, which I remember I used it 10 years ago actually, but I was looking at it again today. It's called Reason. And what Reason gives you is essentially a rack full of effects and synthesizers and drum machines, analog synthesizers, digital synthesizers, physical modeling synthesizers, sequencers, all kinds of effects. You can do mastering. It's got a beautiful analog synthesizer in it actually, which is worth mentioning because a good analog synthesizer is very, very hard to get, and people spend a lot of money on digital synthesizers that try and emulate an analog sound. But the analog sound of an original analog synthesizer is very different, can be very, very different to the digital sound. I mean, I spent many years trying to find decent software because I'd been spoiled by having a Korg MS-20 synthesizer, which was a 2-oscillator analog synthesizer that I got in the early 1980s. And the sound of that was absolutely astonishing. I've recorded entire albums using a Korg MS-20, along with a Korg SQ10, its sequencer. It sounded beautiful, and it's hard to get to reproduce that kind of thing in software. But nevertheless, it is possible. And anyway, you can have synthesizers that maybe don't sound quite as good as a Korg MS-20. You can have as many as you like, and you can have many, many other kinds of instruments. And then there's MIDI controlling it all, and all the kind of hardware you can buy for input. Obviously, you can plug a keyboard in. You can plug in many other kinds of MIDI controller, and you can do amazing things. That's the theory of it. Okay? So, but my experience of all this has been, in sociology and history, they talk about combined and uneven development, a concept I'm sure you're familiar with. In history, it takes the form of saying that history sort of goes forwards and backwards at the same time in peculiar ways and leapfrogs itself. So, for example, an example that I've heard used many times, it concerns Russia in the early part of the 20th century, where it saw the Bolshevik uprising and the Russian Revolution in 1917. And people ask, why is it that the Bolsheviks should triumph, this Marxist party, a party of labour, of the proletariat? How comes it triumphed in such a backward country? It was a largely rural country, and that's absolutely true. But it was rural, overwhelmingly a peasant population. But the fact is that at the same time that it was overwhelmingly rural with a peasant population, at the same time it had huge factories. I believe that the Putilov Works was the biggest factory in the world, but in any case it had colossal factories in principally St. Petersburg, but anyway, had these huge factories. And that's what they call combined and uneven development, because Russia was both very backward as a whole, but very advanced in another way with modern technology that had been brought in, because it didn't have to upgrade all of its existing factories. Investors could come in and just plonk down a massive factory. So you'd have the Putilov Works was mentioned. You'd have this huge factory, ideal situation for a Marxist, thousands of workers in one place that you can unionise and agitate amongst. And the point is that that's a very contradictory situation with elements that are both very advanced capitalism in this case, and other elements, the context as a whole, that's very backward. So I want to borrow that concept from history and politics and apply it to the history of electronic music since the 1970s, because I think we've seen huge steps forward, amazing tools being given to musicians. But at the same time, in many ways, that's been a very retrogressive move. And I'm sure there are already many people who would agree with the idea that it's retrogressive in some quite subtle sense about the difference between digital and analog and hands-on. My friend Ben Watson, out to lunch, used to go on all the time about how he hated electronic music and musicians sat behind laptops. They might as well be writing an end of year business report or consulting. Maybe they are. Maybe there have been electronic musicians who were sort of sat behind a laptop and they're actually filling in their expenses while they're playing a gig. It's quite possible. So he's very critical of that side of thing, and probably quite rightly so. I actually gave up doing gigs as an electronic musician after I then said that to me, because I realised I was just sat there behind a laptop. So I get the criticism. But I'm not really talking about that high-level sort of thing. I'm talking about the music itself and the tools that are used to make it. And in order to explain my argument, I want to sort of zoom out a little bit and tell the story of my engagement with electronic music. So I remember, before I knew what electronic music was or had made any or anything like that, but as a teenager, I guess, the kind of things that really caught my interest, that I took notice of in music. It's only later that I realised that some of them were quite odd. And I'll just give one example. I was a massive David Bowie fan. This is in the mid-70s, 1974, 1975. I was a huge David Bowie fan. But one of my favourite moments in Bowie that really got my attention, and I thought it was a very special moment, was the last few seconds of his single, John, I'm Only Dancing. And I'll probably play a bit of it at this point and work it into the conversation. But the last bit of it, as it ends, Mick Ronson just feeds back on his guitar, and it's put through a tremolo, and it's modulated. But it's just this little electronic, I wouldn't call it a howl, but this electronic sound. Again, I'll insert it so I don't have to describe it. People will get what I mean. But I thought that was absolutely fabulous, and so I think what I was doing was I had a real interest in the sort of timbre of music. And rock music itself is electronic music, by the way. I don't just mean in the trivial sense that these days you buy it digitised. I was going to say on a CD, but these days you don't even do that. You get it online from Spotify or something, so it's highly, digital, electronic. But I don't mean that. What I mean is that rock music and blues music, even before that, going right back to the beginning of the 20th century, that music was electronic music in the sense that it exploited. As soon as you started recording music, that exploited the nature of technology and changed the sound. If you listen to an early vinyl record, it doesn't sound anything, I guess, like having the musicians in the room, although people, surprisingly, used to say that it did. Because the technology was new to them. They thought it was marvellous that you could hear this at all. But by modern standard, it's very, very lo-fi. So already you're modulating the sound, okay? This is a very narrow band, kind of bandpass filter, if you like. You get a weird sound coming out of the whatever mechanism, the tape machine or whatever you're using to play it back. But much more than that, blues and then rock music increasingly relies on electronic effects and distortion. So they say that the first proper rock and roll record was recorded by Jackie Brenson, who I think was just part of Ike Turner's band set up in the 50s. But at some point, Ike Turner recorded many, many things. And so one of his band, Jackie Brenson, recorded this single, Rocket 88, I think. And the story is that on the way to the recording session, his amp was damaged. I mean, the speaker cone was ripped, and it made a highly distorted sound, which you can hear on the record. And pedants put that down as being the birth of rock and roll music. Doesn't matter whether they're actually right. The important point is that distortion of this electron, this effect, is a key part of rock music. The same story is told about the Kinks many years later. All of the Day, All of the Night, I can't remember which single, but their first singles, You Really Got Me. They say that, a speaker cone got ripped and they invented distortion, which, that may have actually happened, but it's certainly leveraging the memory of Jackie Brenson one way or another. So rock music is itself electronic. But what I'm talking about, tonight is electronic music made with instruments that are very brazenly electronic things, and they're used to make strange sounds compared to traditional instruments. So Jackie Brenson may have had a distorted sound, but it was a distorted sound of an acoustic instrument, a guitar. Whereas the electronic music I want to talk about is very much made with the fact that it's electronic foregrounded. To give an example of that, in the 60s, for example, when the first synthesizers were being made, the people who used them, the records that they made, the recordings that they made, it was very much foregrounded that this was a kind of avant-garde, technologically advanced kind of thing. So much so that a lot of early adopters were more or less seen as magicians and wizards, able to control and harness this technology. But the technological aspect of that is foregrounded. And people used electronic instruments, and by that I don't just mean synthesizers, although I've mentioned them. Before that, Stockhausen was using just oscillators, shortwave radio receivers, reel-to-reel tape machines were used, and then the tape was cut up and manipulated. Very famously, that's the basis of the BBC radiophonic workshop. They're using kind of tape manipulation all the time, and in fact they produced some magnificent books on how to do that yourself. I remember owning one of them in the late 70s, and you got your kit out, you recorded stuff, and you sliced the tapes up, and you could put them back together again and slow them down, manipulate them in all kinds of ways. It's extremely interesting. Some extremely interesting music was made using those sort of techniques. So, as I say, this is all foregrounding the technological aspect of it. And I think the thesis, if you want to call it that I want to defend tonight, is the idea that compared to that, a lot of modern technology is extremely restrictive. And I'll talk a little in more detail about that shortly. But at the moment, I just want to go on a little bit more about the background to all of it. So what you had was this situation in the late 60s. Think about that switched on Bach. Who was that? Walter stroke Wendy Carlos. The technological aspect of it, again, was talked about all the time. There's marvellous new machines, the Moog, enabled you to reproduce classical music, which is an interesting example of the idea that new technologies often take old forms. The first motor cars are based on horse-drawn carriages. First fridges, well, anyway, I don't want to go into it. The first fridges had nicely rounded edges for technical reasons because they were modelled on. They weren't square where you could fit them in a room. Now, why am I saying all this? Because I'm just saying that at that point, often the modern technology, the new technologies that were emerging, were very much sold as their ability to reproduce the old technology. So very much the same way they'll say to you today, buy this synthesizer, it can make the sound of a piano, a bass, go through all the instruments, you can distort it, you can do this, you can do everything, they say, that a traditional instrument could do. So early on that was emphasised. Slowly musicians decoupled themselves from it. Clearly Stockhausen had been doing that already for a very long time. But by the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, people are doing really wild things that are enabled by technology. We could talk about the Beatles and the things that George Martin did, and people who know something about that, the techniques that he encouraged them to employ. But I think about something like Tomorrow Never Knows and the sounds on that. I think that's some really interesting things happening in that. Even more interesting things, arguably, were happening in some of John Lennon's solo electronic albums, where he used all kinds of techniques of montage and cut up, working with tapes to assemble. What was it? Life with the Lions, the Wedding album, early electronic records, compared with which, by the way, George Harrison recorded some extremely boring synthesizer music, and that was quite dull. But all of that was going on. People were experimenting with technology. They were slowly loosening up, using it in new ways. Tape montages of John Lennon. There were a group MEV in the Italian group were they were free improvisers, but they were improvising with all kinds of instruments and all kinds of electronic devices, distortion, all thrown into the mix. So this has got a radical period, the 70s. In the pop charts, people took early synthesizers and made things like Hot Butter by the group Popcorn. But it's basically an what do you call it? An advert, a showcase for, I can't remember which synth actually. Maybe it was another Moog actually. But nevertheless, it was originally done, I think, as a kind of demo showing off the technology. But they turned it into a single, and it was a hit single. And people became aware of these new instruments. Even me, I don't know what year Popcorn came out. But I had been very young then, and I was very much aware of it as the novel sound. So on. Then, shortly after that, groups like Kraftwerk are massively foreground. Again, all part of the foreground. So you've got groups like Kraftwerk, who actually have a hit record, although it's considered a little bit of a novelty at the time. Nevertheless, Autobahn by Kraftwerk Studio alerted many, many people to the possibilities of electronics. So you've got Giorgio Moroder working away in his studio in, can't remember where Giorgio Moroder was based, should know, Cologne, and Kraftwerk working away in there also. So it's a similar environment, and of course Moroder took Donna Summer and made I Feel Love, which again is a totally iconic record for people who enjoy electronic music. If you were of a certain age when that came out, that also, like Kraftwerk, really, really got your attention. And I won't talk about that much more because I want to emphasise instead people are doing much more radical things, like people like MEV, for example, like my favourite group about whom I've written a book, Faust, who were ensconced in their own studio in a former school building in the village of Wummer, outside Hamburg. So their label put them in there, built them a studio, but also gave them the services of Kurt Graupner, who was one of their premier producers of their classical, the Polydor's classical label. And he was there for them full time, helping support them technically in doing quite amazing things. Graupner built special effects units that Faust designed that allowed each musician to alter the other musician's instruments. So instead of, the classic, guitarist or keyboard player had his instrument with all these pedals on the floor if he's a guitarist, controlling their own sound, Faust could control one another's sound. And these were called the Faust machines, and I actually saw one of them once when I met Kurt Graupner at a festival, but that's another story. So that was an amazingly intensive technical environment, but one in which radical methods were employed by the musicians, like altering one another's sound and so on. So you get very innovative rock music coming out of the Wummer studio from Faust between 1970 and 1972. You've got the avant-garde groups like MEV and other improvising electronic groups, as well as the kind of classical musicians, Franco Evangelisti. This is coming out of the Darmstadt Stockhausen situation. All very interesting things. I'm not here to tell the history of that aspect of it, but take my word for it. These are radical, innovative, exciting developments for musicians and for everybody. So that's great. Then you had in popular music around the time I left school at the age of 16 in 1975, just in time, in the right time, if not the right place, because I joined the military, so I was definitely in the wrong place, but I was at the right time to enjoy punk rock and become a punk rocker, I guess. But spilling out of punk rock with these radical improvising, technical, electronic groups, so all of the industrial music scene, basically, Throbbing Gristle, things like that. So they were also doing extremely interesting things. Throbbing Gristle made their own equipment, Chris Carter made the gristleizers. They used very primitive analogue equipment. They indeed had a Korg MS-20, few Korg MS-20s. In fact, I'm told that the MS-20 they had was originally owned by my friend Simon Crabb from Bourbonnais, Cork. He sold them an MS-20, at least that's what he claims, and he has some fantastic stories, some of which are true. So who knows? Crabb says that he sold Throbbing Gristle their MS-20, but they did crazy things. They modified, Cozy modified her guitar. That was modified, I don't know who did the work, to be very different, to make a very different sound to what the traditional guitar makes, heavily treated. And their whole attitude to music was improvised. It wasn't a rock music attitude. They were much more radical and thoroughgoing. I heard my first Throbbing Gristle when I read a review of their, depending on how you count, second album, Dead on Arrival, and the review basically said that it was terrible and loathsome music, and it sounded pretty grim. So I thought I'd give it a try, and I ordered a copy of it. But when it arrived, track 1 side 1 opens up with, what they did was they took a cassette from an early computer. Now you know that early domestic commercial computers, they carried the data on cassettes, so you would get a cassette recorder and hook it up to your machine, play the cassette, and that would be translated into code. Well, it was code. But anyway, that was that was how a program was loaded onto the machine, was to play a cassette. So Throbbing Gristle simply played the cassette as part of the album. They then played on top of it, but the album opens with this blast of noise, which is the sound of digital programming, right? Again, I'll cut it in here, that'll be useful. And that's the kind of thing, the Rolling Stones weren't likely to do. Well, that's not that different what Lennon was doing, to be fair. But anyway, these are pretty exciting things. It's it was sort of Wild West situation. Pretty primitive technology, but you could mix and match it in many different ways, in any way you wanted, really. So to me, that was a very exciting time. I got involved with another of the industrial groups, Cabaret Voltaire, and I was corresponding with Chris Watson, who was the main, the interesting guy in Cabaret Voltaire. The other two guys were like basically Woolworth synthesizers, but Chris was a real innovator. He was really interested in the technology. He'd been an engineer for Tyne-Tees Television. Was it Tyne-Tees? Anyway, for local television in the northeast. He'd worked that came later. Originally he worked for what became British Telecom, so he was an engineer working on phone lines, and he took a lot of the technology used in phone systems and applied it to electronic music. I'll give you an example of that. If you transmit across the Atlantic, in the old system, they used to send many different phone calls all over one wire across the Atlantic. And the way they did that, it's called time division multiplexing. So they basically, if you're listening to my voice, the phone system would capture the voice electronically and then chop it up. So let's say in every second, it would chop it up into 1,000 bits, right? Okay, so a millisecond long, smaller actually, but it doesn't matter. It chop it up into bits, and then it would remove some of the bits. So like the first bit, it would leave in, the second, third, fourth, whatever, it left out, and then it put in the next bit, right? But that was enough information for you when it was played back to hear the original voice and know exactly what was being said. And that's why telephones sounded that way, right? But what they did is, so the first millisecond, for the sake of example, is your voice, but the next millisecond would be somebody else's, right, who's also speaking down the same wire as you. So they basically chop everyone's voice up into slices, interleave the slices, then unchop them at the other end and reassemble them back into separate voices. Now there's a loss of audio quality there because you're cutting out a lot of each voice, but there's enough for speech. You just speak across the Atlantic. Chris took that technology and applied it in Cabaret Voltaire. He would take signals and he would cut them up in exactly the way I've described, and he specialised in doing things, for example, like if you're cutting up a signal in that way, you've got these many different parts. Now, one key factor is how many bits you drop. So what proportion of the signal, of it, what any given individual voice, any individual signal, what proportion of it do you retain? If you're keeping 1 millisecond every 5, then you're dropping 80% of the signal. Okay, again, that doesn't damage the signal in terms of transmitting the sound of your voice and the sense, but you lose a lot of what would be hi-fi quality in another context. So the end result sounds distorted, but it's perfectly intelligible for a voice. Now, you can increase the amount of frames that you drop, or you can decrease it. But the more frames you drop, the less intelligible the sound is. Now, obviously, as I say, British Telecom, they're keeping enough there for it to be very intelligible. But if you wanted, as an engineer, you could just drop that rate back to the edge of intelligibility. And you'll find on some on some Cabaret Voltaire records, you'll hear very distorted sounds that are at the limits of what you can conceive what they're saying. But you can kind of, that someone's speaking, that it makes sense, but it's not always entirely sure what's going. It's not always entirely clear what's going on. And that's an example of Chris taking British Telecom technology and applying it to electronic music. He had many synthesizers made for him, and synthesizer parts made for him that were pretty unique. This guy who made parts for him, Chris gave me his details, and this guy also made me, for example, a ring modulator. So you'd get these units that were in like white plastic tubes that his hands sawn off and sealed off the ends of, and inside would be a little board with electronics on, and you could plug into it, and that's what my ring modulator looked like. And you would talk to the guy who made it and say, can you make me a distortion effect that's like this, but with these parameters? And he would make you one, and send it to you. He couldn't make it himself yet. But it's very different to buying a synthesizer from Woolworths, right? Or not usually Woolworths, but down in Denmark Street, you go in, you buy a posh synthesizer, you're getting what's sold to you. You're not handcrafting it. Now, of course, they'll tell you that this thing can do so many things. You can turn it to your own devices, but you never do really. It's always the machine's always remained in charge of the user, usually anyway. But my point is that wasn't the case back then, and so. Other things, a great turning point for me in my appreciation of music came when Chris from Cabaret Voltaire, Chris came to stay with me when I lived on the island of Portland, just off Weymouth, on the south coast, Dorset. I was in a military base there, and living on the Married Quarters, housing estate on the edge of a cliff in Portland, right? But Chris came to stay with me because he wanted to record. He was really into recording wildlife, and he wanted to record the foxes who famously were in the quarries that are left all over Portland, where they dug out all that Portland stone that you see cropping up the Bank of England and the whole area of the City of London. So in those quarries, they're all abandoned. There were foxes and all kinds of other wildlife, and Chris came to stay with me to record them. He had this beautiful little Nagra reel-to-reel, absolutely beautiful work of art, piece of technology, analogue, amazing thing. And these highly directional microphones, they could point his microphones at something far away and get a good recording. I should mention in passing that Chris was in the early days of recording the sounds of nature back then when he stayed with me, which would be like 1980, I guess, maybe 81. But he's gone on to become one of the world's leading nature recorders. He's been used by David Attenborough many times, on all kinds of programs on TV, and released many records based on his incredible recordings of the natural world. I have a 7-inch single limited edition release by Chris that he recorded he was got on a little boat that took him out to this tiny island. I think he was actually off Japan, but not that it really matters. But in this tiny island, and dropped him off overnight. And when I say tiny, it was 10 or 20 feet across or something absolutely ridiculous. And the point is that Chris wanted to record underwater, but it's a bit like when you try and record, a bird in your back garden in London. It's to point your mics at the bird, But what you don't notice is all the traffic sounds that your brain is always cutting out. Yeah, the recorder doesn't have a brain, so the recorder picks all that up, so you get all this rumbling of cars that you might not have noticed while you were recording. Same thing happens at sea. If there's any boats around, the churning of their engines is going to mess up your recording. So what Chris did was get himself dropped off at this island and to stay overnight when there weren't going to be any ships in the region, so he could drop his microphones down and do some recordings. So I have this 7-inch recording of the Santa Water, and you can hear all these popping noises, and Chris tells me that the popping noises are cod burping. You may or may not know that cod burp. I have a record of cod burping. One comes right up near the mic and burps quite close to it. It's very clear. But anyway, it's a really interesting record. But the story I wanted to tell is what Chris did while he was staying with me in 81. What he did was he recorded some seagulls that were flying by the cliffs of Portland. Portland arises almost vertically, certainly on one side, almost vertically out of the sea. And then there's very tall cliffs and then on top of the island. But Chris was able to record the sound of seagulls who were flying around as they do, squawking as they do, by the cliffs, near the cliffs. And the cliffs gave the sound of the seagulls obviously a reverberant sound. So he recorded this at the highest speed on his Lagrely with his unidirectional mics, and was playing back to me the sound of these seagulls, and it was a really beautiful sound. But the point is he then slowed the tape down to a fraction of the Nagra, and all different speeds, but a Nagra you could drop the speed right down and right up. It could record very fast. If you recorded very fast and then played it back at its slowest speed, what you got from the sound of the seagulls was, instead of the high-pitched squeaking or whatever you want to call it, the seagull, you got a deep booming bass sound. But not only that, you got the reverberation from the cliffs had turned into a really long echo. So you've got the rising bass sound and this huge echo. If you didn't know it was a recording of seagulls, you could easily pass this off as an industrial record in and of itself, especially with noise musicians. It's a beautiful thing to listen to. But the point is, it was done by recording nature and then taking a radical electronic technique, slowing down the sound, which is only something you can only do with modern technology. There's no way of doing that. So it's a completely modern sound, even though it's the sound of a seagull. When I heard that, my first thought was exactly what I just said. I thought, this sounds amazing. And it sounds like amazing what I'd been hearing as electronic music, but in fact it was a natural sound. It was deeply alienated, alienated from itself, made to sound very different. Unrecognisable as a seagull. But I was blown away by that. Obviously Chris Watson was as well, because that's why he left Cabaret Voltaire shortly afterwards and set off on his long career path to become the world's leading nature recordist, really, because it sounds very... He released on another record the sound of a cockroach hissing that he recorded in a New York apartment, and honestly it's like a minor electronic masterpiece. You'd think it was symphonic the way it's organised, because he treats it slightly, but only to clarify it is the sound of the cockroach. And so all of these amazing things were possible. And this brings me to the turning point of my argument, because I got into electronic music then because of all this. I started using synthesizers, analog equipment, etc., etc. But I also, shortly after that, I left the military and I went to a college called the Cooperative College, where they basically paid your expenses and gave you money to live on and gave you accommodation, and they let you spend a year writing a thesis of your own choice, and they would support you with the kind of academic knowledge you needed to write the thesis, so you could choose what modules you needed to write a thesis. But the thesis I wrote at the time is called Dada Futurism and Industrial Music, and There you go. You see a bit of it. And the actual thesis, the idea behind it was, and I'll give you the formula, which I have mentioned to you before, and then I'll try and explain it. Thesis was that one day children will go to school whistling tunes that the original of which was created entirely electronically. So this is my bit of futuristic navel gazing. Right? This is going to happen, right? And this is why. And so my thesis was a paean to electronic music and its potentialities. The problem was that not long after I wrote it, then the first records started appearing that were made pretty much entirely electronically. And the problem was that the hidden premise of my thesis was that were it happen that children go to school whistling tunes, the original of which were created entirely electronically, that would be good. I assumed that would be a really, really good thing. But then they started releasing these records. Like I remember Paul Hardcastle, 19, and he's scratching, and you're beginning to get this high technical music, and it was pretty boring, compared to Throbbing Gristle's, program tape being put through a massive PA system. It was sort of dull by comparison, but quite technical. And of course, the music became increasingly technical as they introduced samplers and MIDI. And that was the problem. The combination of samplers and MIDI meant that for many, many years to come, all music just became very, very cyclical and repetitive. Now, one of the paradoxes of all this technology is that in theory, you can do amazing things, right? And not only in theory, if you really know the technology, you can do some pretty outrageous and amazing things. But very few people bother doing that. So you had all this kind of high electronic music going on, and I think of the Aphex Twin, Autechre, groups like that. And a lot of it was deeply, deeply dull. And what I noticed, for example, was that the Aphex Twin, Richard James, he's somebody who really does know what he's doing, and he took the existing technology and I would say used it in amazingly interesting and creative ways. And he really explored the technology. I remember I was in a user group, software user group that he was in for the programming language Super Collider, which you can do very powerful things with. And he did. He took that technology, which was an extant technology, this is quite a long time ago now, and he used it to good effect. But he was one among many, many who didn't. The vast majority didn't. And I'll give you an example. If you think of a group like Autechre, who are kind of known as, pretty advanced, doing amazing electronic things, the first ever record I heard by them, I put it on, and the very first track was actually just a demo program. If you installed Super Collider, there was a demo program in it called Rolling Rocks. And if you ran that, that's it. They just ran Rolling Rocks and recorded it. Okay? Just like the other two guys in Cabaret Voltaire bought a Woolworths synth, turned it on, turned around some freaky filter or something, but it was just the technology doing what it did by default. And that is what essentially, it's a tellable story that, because it was just the Rolling Rocks demo, but that symbolises the attitude of many people to technology and the way that the technology dominates them. It can be very expressive and used to very expressive ends, but it usually isn't. Instead of the user using the technology uses the user, and it doesn't always have to be that way. And I'll give you a couple more examples of. Why should anyone care about this? Why should people worry that the technology isn't being properly exploited? We could use it more. And the reason for that is that music that just sits where technology is boring music by definition. If you're not doing something, beyond that, if all you're doing is doing what modern computers, or it used to be samplers plus MIDI or whatever, if you're just doing what they let you do out of the box, then it's not going to be interesting, because the music itself, the technology itself doesn't make good music. It has to be bent, to some purpose, and most people don't. Most people are rolling with what it does, and the sound of the technology is so new to us that, in a sense, people are, they just get cut a lot of slack, and they're allowed to be quite lazy in what they do. I sound like I'm just moaning now. I wanted to be a bit more positive than that, and say, say that so I want to give a couple of examples of technical things that I've done in music. One thing I always fancied, when you look at a computer, when I used to look at computers 25 years ago, it's longer than that now, I could imagine them, what they might do. They might make the most awesome kind of jumble of noise. They might make sounds that you've never heard before, incredibly freakish things that you didn't expect. I just looked at the computer and I thought, wouldn't it be great if they could do that? But what people did instead was make, highly repetitive beat music, because you could just you make a few notes in MIDI, and the easiest thing to do is take that and cut and paste and repeat it. And do the same thing over and over again. And the MIDI fires off a sampler. The sampler's loaded with samples that you either bought or maybe you modified them a bit. You can sit there and go through hundreds of samples of a bass drum to pick the sound of a bass drum you want, but then your MIDI trigger plays that bass drum. And that's quite a boring effect overall of technology. But imagine what it could do. And if you do imagine what it could do, then you look at what it is doing, it's quite disappointing. So I got that feeling when Eno released a program called Koan. And what Koan would do was generate MIDI according to parameters that you gave it. So you would set parameters, but then as Koan ran, it would interpret your parameters into a stream of MIDI that was kind of musical, quite musical-like. But you couldn't predict what it was going to do, even though you'd kind of engineered it. So it's generating MIDI, and people would plug that into keyboards and synthesizers and samplers, and it would play this generative music. I thought that was so incredibly lazy, given that by the time it was released, sort of mid-90s, you could already not generate triggers for samplers, but you could actually generate sound using computers, just about. I mean, obviously, if you had a massive computer at some university music department, you could do astonishing things. But I'm talking about, a computer you might buy wherever people buy computers from. Bought computers from in those days. A computer you could buy at Woolworths, essentially. Get a domestic computer that's running then Windows, stuff like that. It could make much more interesting things than MIDI signals. So once Eno produced Koan, I decided to write a program that would, instead of generating, in the sense of generative music, instead of generating MIDI triggers, it would generate sound. So I created a program, it was called that because it raided your hard drive for sounds. When you installed it, it looked, in the first instance, in slash Windows /system /sounds, and have a look what was there. And then it would start searching all over your hard drive. You couldn't do this these days. It's searching all over your hard drive for any WAV files or AU files or audio files. And then it would stretch and manipulate and loop according to algorithms I wrote. So essentially you ran the program and it just created this stream of industrial tape, sounds like tape manipulation, industrial sounds, machinery, things like that. Certainly electronic sounds, the sounds of all the bleeps and whirring and all the things that you hear in your computer, the Windows startup sound, all of that was mangled together and generated as sound because computers were capable of doing that. So it wasn't neat and tidy like the kind of, I don't know enough music theory to be able to say whether the MIDI that Koan generated was strictly tonal, but it was that kind of boring. I mean, Eno's the man who ambient music you don't have to listen to because it isn't worth listening to. So he made a machine for generating that with MIDI. It wasn't like that. It wasn't neat and tidy. You would notice it if it was turned up above a minimal volume. You would have noticed Sound Raider, whereas Koan you might not have noticed if it was playing at a lift. But nevertheless, the point I'm trying to make is that, we were leveraging what a computer is capable of. But people didn't want to hear that. They just wanted to make this simple stuff instead. And later on I did a variation on the same theme with the group K-Space, which involved Tim Hodgkinson and Henry Cow, who I knew, but his two sidekicks in K-Space were Gendos, I'll come to Ken Hyde, the jazz drummer, amazing, and Gendos, who's a Siberian shaman. And there was an improvising, shamanic, free improv type of group. But I was talking to Tim at one point about how they improvise. And he said, in very broad terms, he said, if I'm doing this kind of thing, it's, doing this kind of, it could be, this could be anything. It could be a style of music or a mood or whatever. But he said, we have these informal rules. If I'm doing this kind of thing, then Ken will either do that kind of thing or that kind of thing. And Gendos might do this or that. But if he does this, then Ken might do that. And essentially, it was sort of rule-driven in a very loose way. So I was able to write a program that took those rules and took samples, not samples of an instrument, but proper recordings of each of the musicians, and then remixed them according to compositional rules designed by Tim Hodgkinson. So what you got was a CD that you put it in your computer, and every time you played it, it was different. It mixed it differently, not just the levels, the timings, when instruments came in, but it was different every single time. And I did write down earlier today, because I was preparing for this meeting, when all of this was going on. So I think I've got to refer to my notes here. Let me have a look. Yeah, so Sound Raider was 1997. And in the Infinity, the thing I did with K-Space, we made this CD that, as I say, reconfigured the music every time it played according to Tim's compositions. It was called the Infinity Project. So the Infinity CD, which was was released in 2010. And I'm sort of, I'm not. Why am I talking about these things that I made? I'm not grandstanding here, because I just want to say, for good or ill, the technology you're buying is not doing what a computer would allow it to do. It's doing something much tighter than that. So you could be doing this crazy stuff like the K-Space Infinity thing, or like Sound Raider. There was a guy in America who toured. He went on tour, and he had what they call a headless computer, a computer that had a monitor. And he just set it up so that when it booted up into Sound Raider, and it just started playing Sound Raider. And then he didn't need a monitor, he just arranged it so that's how it booted up. And then he just took the audio out and put that through a PA system. And he went on tour of Sound Raider. He didn't call it Sound Raider, he went on tour himself, but he played Sound Raider, and that's all he did, right? So these are real world things that you could do. The Infinity thing was we could have hand cranked it, but the technology could have been mass produced, and you could have been doing these amazing things where your CD remixes it. Remixing doesn't cover it. Too weak a word for what we did. The composition is reinterpreted every time you played the CD. So you could have been doing either of those things, since for at least the last 15 years, the technology enabled it, but people aren't doing that. What they're doing with the technology is much more constrained. And I think it raises all kinds of issues and questions, and I hope you're going to ask me some of them now, Conor. I've gone on and on, but I wanted to paint this picture of a sort of hopeful 70s, this explosion of interest in electronic music and the kind of radical things you could do with it. People did those radical things. So I mentioned Lennon, Faust, and so on. Then you get the kind of punk electronica, Clubbing Gristle, industrial music, Cabaret Voltaire, and so on. That too continued that tradition. Now that's very much, if you listen to underground groups like Nurse with Wound, they are very, very much in the tradition of Faust. Steve Stapleton of Nurse with Wound, practically, I think he must be one of them. He once, as a young man, went hitchhiking across Europe to visit Faust in Weimar. He arrived there when they were off on tour. But nevertheless, he was a pretty dedicated fan. So that gives you some idea of Steve Stapleton of Nurse with Wounds' relationship with Faust. But I mention it only to illustrate the general point that the industrial, underground, electronic musicians of that era harked back to things like Faust, the experimentation of the 60s. That was the situation by the late 70s, early 80s and into the 80s. But when they finally got released all this amazing new technology to the masses, I'm talking about MIDI and samplers, everything went off in this other direction. There's nothing wrong with that other direction. I'm not being a snob about the music. All I'm saying is it was incredibly narrow, because it was like painting with a tiny, tiny palette of a couple of colours, because everything had to be cyclical, everything was beat-driven. Say everything, somebody's going to object that they don't give this and that examples. Many people were making great music, which doesn't fit my argument. I'm cool with that. The Aphex Twin was. What I'm trying to describe is the generality in which the technology just drove everybody in one particular direction.